Cool. Okay, so I can walk through Nightshade.
Sure. But Dean, any specific questions you wanna tackle right off the top? The two that come to mind for me are with respect to like reversion of a transaction when you have cross shard communication, and then just sort of like fundamental security assumption differences versus ETH2.
Yeah, I think the easiest one to run through at the beginning is what's the difference between near sharding and ETH2?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. So I will just quickly walk through Nightshade, and then we'll go from there. So in Nightshade, I will assume that neither of you know Nightshade very deeply, so I will go into detail. Right. So instead of having a lot of shard chains, instead we have instead there's only one blockchain, and so it builds blocks. The way blocks are built are also interesting, but I guess it's unrelated to sharding.
So block propagation and finality is somewhat similar to Polkadot's relay chain, correct?
The only thing that is similar to Polkadot is data availability, which is practically taken from Polkadot one-to-one. So every block logically contains all the transactions and all the shards. So every block will contain some sort of header, which contains a global state root, global transaction root across all shards. And then logically it contains all the transactions in all the shards, but physically it contains what we call chunks, one per shard. So if there's four shards, the block would contain chunk for shard 1, for shard 2, 3, etc. Some of them may be missing, right? If the block producer didn't get the chunk in time, the chunk will be missing. So for every shard, the block will contain 1 or 0 chunks. And then the next block will contain, again, chunk for the first shard, for the second, for third, etc. Whichever it managed to collect in time.
What are chunks?
So chunks is what in ETH2 would be the shard block, right? So chunk.
Okay.
Chunk.
So you include the entire shard block?
You include the header of it, right?
Okay.
So the block effectively contains the block header and chunk header for every chunk. Now what happens is there's everybody produces blocks, right? So if you have a set of block producers, let's say you have 200, they will all be taking turns producing blocks, but they will be split into shards, and every shard will have a few of them. Like let's say every shard has 10 or like 20 block producers. And so the block producers are out of the whole population of 200, so this is 200 people, let's say, right? So there's 200 total. The first 20 could be working on some shards, the next 20 work on some shards, the next 20 work on some shards, etc. They don't have, each of them doesn't have to have one shard. In reality, most of them will have several shards, but none of them works on all the shards. Or rather, none of them works on on something that is on the order of magnitude of number of shards, right? So if there's 8 shards, probably everybody will be working on 1 or 2. If there's 100 shards, everybody will be working like on 5, right? And so among those 20, they have a schedule of producing chunks, right? So there's going to be a fixed schedule of length 20, right? So every 20 blocks it will repeat, right? And so for example, if this was height 7 and this was height 8, then for height 7, for every chunk, there was a particular block producer who was assigned to produce chunk. And the moment they received the previous block, and the moment they managed to fetch the chunk for their shard, right? So let's consider the particular person who's responsible for producing chunk for shard 1 at this height. When they received the previous block at height, well, hopefully it was height 6, didn't have to be. They received chunk for height 1. The moment they receive the block, they will try to fetch the chunk, and in a second I will tell how we make it very likely that they will be able to. The moment they fetch the chunk for their shard, they apply it, they get the new state root, they get transactions from their transaction pool, and they create a new chunk.
Okay.
which they immediately send to the block producer for 7.
How many times are the validators in shards shuffled?
Like once every half a day, let's say.
Okay.
Right.
Because in Ethereum, in ETH2, it's like every 6 minutes, I think, right?
Right. So we will get back to those differences, I guess. First, I want to talk about like data availability and overall structure, and then start comparing why they can and we cannot shuffle every 6 minutes, and how that affects like adaptive corruption and what we do to prevent it.
Yeah.
So one thing is that in this design I just talked about, one big problem is that chunks might not be available, right? So this person who created the chunk, if they are malicious, they can create a chunk. Like naturally, the block producer cannot download all the chunks. That will effectively mean they have to download all the transactions for all the shards. So like that completely eliminates, well, not completely, but it eliminates most of the benefits of sharding. Obviously, the block producer can only see the headers and maybe a little bit other information. So if this block producer, chunk producer was malicious, then they would send enough information to the block producer to include chunk 1, but not enough information to the rest of the network for the chunk to be recoverable, right? And so the next chunk producer, when the block 7 is produced, they will not be able to fetch the chunk, so they will not be able to create the next one. That would be pretty bad. So the way we do that is, when the chunk producer produces the chunk, they, like, let's say this is the chunk, they split it into small parts, and they erasure code it, and they send, and so each of the shares of the erasure coded chunk has a particular block producer who is known. Like everybody can easily locally compute who is the block producer who's dedicated to each of those parts, and so of those shares, and each share is sent to that particular block producer, right? And so for as long as, so let's say we do like, I don't know the correct terminology, but let's say the number of data shares is like k, and the number of parity shares is, let's say, 2k, right? So for as long as 1/3 of those block producers who receive the parts, the shares, are online and behaving properly, everybody will be able to reconstruct the chunk. And so for now, for in practice we use 2k parity shards, but for theoretical analysis, let's use 5k. 5k has better guarantees. So now, what happens when the block is produced is every other block producer will only accept this block in one of the two cases. Case number 1 is that they follow the shard, and they were able to fully reconstruct the chunk. And case number 2 is they do not follow the shard, and they had their part, the part that was sent to them specifically, right? Mm-hmm.
Which is far more likely, right?
Most of them do not follow the shard, right? But therefore, let's say that the we assume that 30%. So specifically for data availability, we assume that 30% of at most 30% are misbehaving and 70% are good and honest. Then, if 30% are not sending their parts that were sent to them, because we have because we only need 1/6, right? Because number of data shares is 1/6 of the total. Then, if a block has 50% of people who say we accept the block, if 50% of the block producers accept the block, that means that even 30 of them are lying that they have their part. 1/6 of them is still saying truth, and so every chunk is reproducible, is recoverable. Does that make sense? Yeah. Cool. And there's still a problem. Well, there are going to be many small problems on the way. For all of them, we have some satisfactory solutions. So couple that already happened here. One is that for a chunk producer, it's very easy to grieve the block producer in the sense that they can send them a chunk, but not send it to anyone else, right? So yeah, nobody will recover the chunk, and people will ignore the block. But block was like the block producer lost their reward. The entire system missed a heartbeat because the block was not included ultimately, right? So that's pretty bad. The way we fight with that is the block producer, after producing the block, will try to sample a couple parts for every chunk. And for the chunks for which they fail to do that, they will never accept the chunks from the chunk producer. So the chunk producer will be able to grieve once, but that's acceptable. I mean, they never be able to produce any chunk with that particular block producer again. Another problem is that someone can
wait. Couldn't it theoretically in like the next block that chunk producer could produce could produce that chunk and send it to the block producer along with the previous chunk, and then
But the previous
and essentially attack the first block producer and give advantage to the second block producer.
So advantage doesn't matter much. The way we produce blocks is called Doomslag. It doesn't give much opportunities for two neighboring block producers to give each other. So two neighboring block producers cannot do much to give each other, whether or not they have some advantage. Now, if a chunk producer sends enough information to the next block producer to fully reconstruct the chunk in the previous block, then that next block producer has the chunk. So everybody will be able ultimately to collect sufficient number of parts or shares from that block producer. So effectively, the chunk is available. What the chunk producer can try to do is they can try to grieve the first block producer successfully, right? As I said, they will be successfully able to grieve once every block producer. So what they can do is they can grieve once this block producer, once this block producer, once next block producer, etc. And so effectively they can stall the system for a while. The way we prevent that is that when the first block is produced, when the second block producer sees the first block, if they're not able to recover some chunks quickly, they will, until they recover a particular chunk, they will not accept anything from that chunk producer. Right? So if chunk producer gives the first block producer, the second, until they're able to fetch that chunk, they will not be accepting chunks from that chunk producer, and so they will not be grieved. If they control multiple chunk producers, they will still be able to.
Necessarily then stop the propagation of those chunks?
No, because the chunk producer doesn't produce chunks in the same shard multiple times, right? So on the next bit, it's going to be a different chunk producer in chunk one, so that will be accepted. Now the chunk producer will make 2 to be skipped on this height, 3 to be skipped on the next height. That's unfortunate, but
unless you have a situation whereby the original chunk producer has been randomly selected to produce the next one.
Yes,
which would happen periodically, but probably not that.
Well, in practice, most of the chunk producers are going to be honest, right? It doesn't happen often that someone intentionally tries to grieve, but the goal is to sort of reduce as much as possible what a bad actor can do especially without being punished. Because in this case, the chunk producer, the only punishment they get is that they're missing reward in the future because they will be kicked out.
They wouldn't necessarily then be slashed if they.
So we do not slash for anything that is not cryptographically provable. You cannot prove that data was not available. You can only prove data availability. So there we're also different from Ethereum. There is no slashing for leaking, or like whatever it's called. And so the only thing they lose really is that they get kicked out eventually because their chunks are not included. If you did not produce enough chunks during the epoch, you get kicked out from the validator set. So that's the only thing they're really risking in this case. Cool. Another thing.
Re-enter the validator set, correct?
That will take them a while, and also everybody already banned them. So when they re-enter, still nobody will be accepting their chunks.
But then wouldn't that also happen when there just isn't data availability from the given chunk, and then that chunk producer will get kicked out, but then not due to their own fault?
Say it again.
So there's 2 instances, right? One is that a chunk producer doesn't have the necessary data to compose the chunk and propose it to the block producer.
Yeah.
The second is that the chunk producer is malicious and has intentionally withheld the chunk from
but it's a different thing when you did not. If you don't have enough data to produce your chunk, that means that the previous chunk was not available to begin with, right?
So the previous parties get slashed.
So for data availability, we never slash. But what will happen in the Ryan's case, so what Ryan says is that imagine that chunk 1 here, for some reason is not available, right? And so the chunk producer for this height, they cannot retrieve the chunk, they cannot produce the block. But in reality, what will happen is that until they retrieve the chunk, they will not even accept this block. So from perspective of the chunk producer for this spot, this block doesn't even exist yet. If they didn't reconstruct the chunk, from their perspective, the head right now is still the block here, and they will be building on top of that.
Which then implies that the block production moves as slow as the slowest chunk production, right? Because the subsequent block isn't accepted until.
Well, at the end of the day, this is sort of Nakamoto consensus, right? So if this chunk is available, this chunk producer would have retrieved it. So this chunk is not available. So ultimately, this block will be completely rejected by the system. Right, because there's not going to be 50% of people who know that. So that will be built.
Chunks, right?
Yeah, But whichever transactions were included here ultimately will be, because that block will get reverted.
Wait, but isn't so that actually ends up being what I wanted to ask about. Whereas, the information or like transactions and messages in these chunks are then negatively impacted by this single chunk producer limiting or hiding their data, right?
But that can happen. Like the number of times they can do this negative impact is limited, because if they did it once, nobody will again accept their chunks.
Sure, but they can also just sybil, right, and just change addresses and then re-enter.
That's per account, right? Because they have stake, so that's per account. That will take them multiple days to re-enter again, because they need to move money.
Sure.
Yes, they need to restake it.
But they can stack those on top of each other, right? You can sybil it and have like multiple accounts, and then just be passing the
yes. So the question is how many of the 200 they control, right? So if there's 200 block producers, what percentage of them they control? That's how much they can give, but also how much they get, right? Because they're losing quite a bit of money by being kicked out, not getting the reward for that epoch. The amount of damage they do is quite limited. They miss
equivalent to inflation over that epoch.
Yes, right? but they're only making the system skip one heartbeat, right? Because if the block is produced every couple seconds, they made the system skip one block, right? By doing that, that's painful. But blocks can be skipped even like under normal circumstances because the propagation was too slow, right? So that blocks will be skipped all the time. That is sort of expected, right? Yeah. But let me also cover another. So as I said, there are many small things that can happen, right? So I will just give example of another small thing. From perspective of a particular chunk producer, right? As I said, they will not accept a block until they see one share of every chunk. Not accepting the block can be damaging for them, because they did not accept the block. They produced a chunk on top of the previous one, but the block ultimately was accepted by the system, and so their chunk was discarded because it's not building on the head of the chain. So that damages them. So for them, it's actually beneficial to say, well, yeah, I sort of have to wait for all the shares, but I will not. I will accept the block optimistically if I have like most of them or whatever. So to prevent against that, what we do is that when we do erasure code, we instead of like, for example, having 200 of those, we have 199 shares, and one share, the 200th one, is what we call a honeypot. And so if you receive a honeypot, you have to report it. And if you sign on the block and you're not reporting that you had a honeypot and you had one, that's a slashable behavior. You get your entire stake slashed, right? And so every time you blindly sign on the block without having a particular share, you have a probability 1/200 of your entire stake slashed. That's not something that any sane person would do, right? And so therefore, people have a very strong incentive to actually truly wait for the shares before signing on the block. And that's just
kind
two
of like in
examples.
Polkadot, right?
So this entire data availability scheme is Polkadot's data availability scheme. I don't know if they have the honeypot idea. Probably they do, but the idea of sending one share to every block producer in the system, that's Polkadot. That is not something we invented. Cool. So that being said,
so then let's chat a little bit about cross shard transactions then.
Yeah.
So when you have like obviously each shard shares consensus, so you don't have, you shouldn't in theory have say substantial time lag between transaction confirmation between shards.
So what happens, so this is where it gets very interesting, because there are sort of two ways in which you can model how transactions are processed, right, in blockchains. In one model, when you produce a chunk, you already execute all the transactions, right? So you're the chunk. Let's erase this. You're a chunk producer. You collect the transactions from the pool. You include them. You apply them, and so the chunk already contains the state root as of after applying the transactions. So this model has a drawback, which if you draw the timeline, right? So let's say that at this point the chunk for height 7 was produced. The block producer who produced it had to apply the transaction, right? So this is, let's say this is the time it took them to apply the transactions. Then they send it to the chunk producer for height 8. The chunk producer for height 8, when they receive it, they first have to apply transactions in 7. They couldn't have been doing it in parallel with the producer of 7. After they applied 7, So they're applying 7 here. Then they need to apply for 8 because they're producing 8. They need to apply it, and then they produce 8, right? So then they sending it to the 9. 9 first need to apply for 8, then apply to 9, right? So so effectively, we have for every height, we serially apply twice the transactions. Does that make sense? So it's like effectively application of transactions for height 8 by the chunk producer happens strictly before that application happens by everybody else. And so therefore, for 100 heights, we will have serially 200 transaction applications, which assuming the transactions are applying, like that's one of the bottlenecks, assuming this is not a negligible time, that's pretty bad. And so a pretty common way of addressing it is having not the post-state root in the block, but rather pre-state root, right? So what happens is that the block producer for the chunk producer for 7 in the 7 includes the pre-state root, so as of after applying 6 and the transactions for 7, and then when they produced it, they themselves start applying 7, and everybody else also in parallel with them start applying 7, right? So that is not serial anymore. This is parallel, right? And so the block producer for 8 can produce chunk producer for 8 produces chunk, includes the pre-state root as of after applying 7, and then they start applying 8 after they send the block, and everybody else applies 8 after the chunk after they receive it. So that shortens 2x the amount of processing time spent serially. But now it has a big problem with sharding. If by the time I produce the chunk, I did not apply transactions, that means that I also don't have the receipts that I need to send to other shards.
Yeah.
Right. So therefore, what will happen if you do it naively is that I create 7. I said and so like now
you need the time to
right? So let's say everything above the axis is for shard 1, everything below is for shard 2, right? So now I create the block for chunk for height 7. Then someone who creates the chunk for height 8, they will apply transactions. Only now they will get the receipts, they will send them out, and so only at height 9, naively, would the second shard be able to apply them, right? And so the difference in heights is 2. That is very unfortunate. So here we have to, unless we come up with something smart, we would either have to use the first approach where we include post-state root, and so the transaction application happens twice serially, or we will have to have 2 heights difference between receiving receipt and applying receipt. So what we do is a little more involved.
Why wouldn't you just increase the number of transaction validators consolidating transactions into 8, and then the block producer can potentially select from a wider range of like chunk producers? Like, why wouldn't you just sort of increase the parallelization of potential options here in the production of 7?
But that doesn't help, right? Because it is still the case that by the time 7 is produced, the receipts are not known yet.
Sure.
Right. So you need to wait for 8 to know the receipts.
To get to 8, you need 7 fully produced
and applied.
Sure, and then all of the transactions inherent in 8, essentially.
No, you don't care yet about the transactions which will get to 8. They will not affect the receipts as of after applying 7.
For block 8.
For block. So here we only care about the specifically what we care about is how quickly a receipt. So the receipt is the second part of it. So like if there's a cross-shard transaction, it applies in one shard, and then it creates a receipt for another shard, and that receipt is effectively a transaction that will be applied in the second shard, right? So the question is how quickly we can have the receipt delivered and included somewhere in the second shard,
but that
which was produced by a transaction in the first.
Sure, but that receipt needs to be validated by a different party than the producing party, correct?
So effectively, if the chunk is included in the block, the chunk is assumed to be valid. That is obviously incorrect assumption. We will talk about that in a second. But if the chunk is included in the block, we always assume it's valid. We never wait for anything. If chunk is included, it's valid, right? Because if it isn't valid, that block will be fully unrolled. So from perspective of the block that builds on top of it, so like let's say block 7 has one of the chunks with invalid state transition. Block 8 can assume this is not the case, because if it is the case, 7 will be unrolled and so will be 8. So if 8 exists, if 8 exists in the future, that means 7 was fully valid.
Yeah.
Right. So when you produce 8, you can assume that 7 is valid. If it is not, 8 will be unrolled with 7.
Sure, but if we unroll 7,
yeah,
then how do we recompose the transactions in there? There has to be another round of
so what will happen?
Of collation of
So if
those
7,
transactions?
right? So if 7 gets unrolled,
Yeah.
right? So let's say 7 was produced, 8 was produced, maybe even 9 was produced,
Sure.
and then we learn that 7 has an invalid state transition, right?
Because chunk 1
was invalid.
was invalid.
So what will happen is that in every so let's think from perspective of some chunk producer who is on shard 3, right? So they in the shard 3. Then as those blocks get unrolled, they will they know the chunks. They will move all the transactions back to the transaction pool, right? And so as they start producing chunks in the new chain, when it forks out, they will be including those transactions into the new chunks.
But that chunk producer in 743
Yeah.
Isn't going to be the chunk. Like he will then reproduce that chunk for 9.
They will not reproduce the exact same chunk, but they will include as many transactions as they can, right? So if the chain gets unrolled, whatever state transition happened, it gets canceled, right? So as a user of the chain, unless like your transaction, even if the block so we have a finality gadget, even if the block was finalized by finality gadget, unless you're certain that there was no invalid state transition in other shards, your transaction can still be unrolled, canceled, and there's no guarantee that it will be included again on the new chain, right? So effectively, your options here are either to, like, if you absolutely cannot allow that to happen, like you're an exchange, well then invest more money and actually have a single server per shard, right? Because if you track every shard, you know if there was an invalid state transition. Then if the block is final, you know there's no invalid state transitions, you know the chain will not be unrolled. Your other option is just to wait sufficiently long, and after some time, you can be relatively certain it's not going to get unrolled.
So the implication of that is then finality is some corresponding number of blocks extra to ensure that can't be reverted.
So this is what Polkadot.
Yeah, you can't have like say sub 5-second finality or something. Right?
Participants who track all the shards do have sub 5 seconds. Well, maybe it's not sub 5 seconds because you need 3 blocks for the finality gadget to finalize something, but it's like sub 10 seconds, right? If you track all the shards, you do have sub 10 second finality. Otherwise, yeah, your 2 options is either wait significantly longer until you're certain the challenge would have propagated, or give 0 Fs and just say, well, like for my use case, nobody will be unrolling my transaction, so it will get back to the chunk anyway.
When can you be certain that a rollback won't occur anymore?
So for rollback, so one thing we plan to do, we did not do it yet because it's not. It has some issues with it. But one of the ideas is that you cannot roll back more than a certain number of heights back, right? So if it's been like an hour, then the challenge must have been propagated by now, and so we can say, we're not going to unroll more than 1 hour back.
But what if you have a transaction that has been like a double spend that's been inserted? You still would not roll back? If
in 1 hour it was not spotted, first of all, probably, like in practice, there's no way it will not be spotted in 1 hour. But let's say it did happen 1 hour later, the damage of unrolling the chain is way bigger than that transaction. So at that point, you need to do some social consensus. You either say, well, guys, we messed up, so the money is doubled. That's unfortunate. Or you're saying, well, guys, we're going to punish them in some way. So at that point, if it's been more than an hour, unrolling the chain is more damage than the double spend.
Well, unless you just extend the finality gadget out as long as you need, right?
But you do want for all practical purposes.
Block propagation, right?
So finality gadget, it is important that finality gadget doesn't wait for that hour because participants who do track all the shards, they should have finality very quickly because they know there is no invalid state transition, right? And B, if you're not transacting $1 million, you still want to have finality, which effectively says, unless an extremely unlikely event of an invalid state transition happened, my transaction is final, right? And so this is actually interesting. So we have 2 levels of finality. This is orthogonal to sharding, but let me quickly touch on that. We have one which we call Dooms-like finality, and another one is like proper BFT finality. So BFT finality is under normal circumstances will be 3 blocks behind. So when you produce block at 10, the block at 7 will have BFT finality, assuming that most of the approvals happen to be included in most of the blocks. And the BFT finality says, unless 1/3 of all the stake is slashed, that block is final, or unless there is an invalid state transition, right? While Dooms-like finality happens on the very previous block. So when one block is produced, the very previous block has Doom's-like finality, and Doom's-like finality says, unless at least someone is slashed, that block is final, which is actually very, very meaningful finality guarantee in practice, because one stake, like if there is 200 block producers, right, and like 30% of the total amount of the total circulating supply is staked, one slashed person is a lot of money.
If any block producer or chunk producer
Is
is
slashed.
slashed in the given epoch, then
Yeah. Then it's final.
finality
Yeah.
is withheld.
Yeah, that's what we call Doom's-like finality. We're saying this block is final unless at least one person is slashed, and one person being slashed is 1/200th of the total stake, right? So it's not as much as 1/3, but it's still a pretty meaningful amount of money. And so Doom's-like finality doesn't care about. Naturally, it already accounts for the possibility of the invalid state transition, because invalid state transition means one person is actually slashed, right? So Doom's-like finality doesn't have this asterisk which says or an invalid state transition happened. It's already accounted for, right? And so Doom's-like finality is what presumably majority of non-DeFi applications would be using, because if you have a game or something like that, or like anything that doesn't operate with a lot of money,
any standard message. However, we do recognize that, like, probably, in all probability, the most is certainly the most compelling use case are ones that are financial messages or financial transactions.
But if you're operating, so like let's say you're operating a lot of money, so like you're an exchange, or you like you do, but the way you use DeFi is with a lot of money, then it is actually very beneficial for you at that point to have to track all the shards. Yeah. In which case you do have actual BFT finality, because you do know that there's no invalid state transition. You will know that there's invalid state transition. You will actually be the one who will send the challenge to the network at that point, right? Yeah. So that's the idea. And so let's get back to the receipts, right? So
yeah, because I'm actually thinking, like, just the time necessary to execute this, we're looking at like
2 blocks, which is too much. But it is actually possible to make it in 1 block, even if you store the pre-state root. The way you do that is pretty interesting. Let me see if I can. It always takes me time to remember all the details.
When somebody produces a block, they produce like a post-state root and pre-state root from that block production. So
you cannot produce post-state root. That's what we just discussed. That would require you That would require you applying it twice.
Finality. Okay.
So the block only includes
it's a pre-finality state root. Okay.
So this is where it gets interesting. It actually heavily relies on our way of doing data availability. So when 7 is produced, it includes the pre-state root, and so therefore it does not have the receipts, obviously.
Sure.
Then there's a block. So this is the chunk, right? So let me draw the block like this, right? So this is the block which includes this chunk, right? So this chunk is here, right? Now, when you're producing the chunk at 8 for shard 2, right? At this point, you downloaded this block. You received this block. You verified that like all the chunks exist, whatever. At this point, you don't know the receipts yet. You know the pre-state root. So you apply 7. Obviously, when you apply 7, you cannot have the receipts from this 7 yet. But we don't want to have 0 blocks. We want to have 1 block, right? So you apply whatever transactions happen to be in 7 for the shard 2. You compute post-state root as of 7. That will be pre-state root as of 8. And you include transactions that you accumulated in your transaction pool. And ideally, you would prefer to also include the receipts from as of after 7 in all other shards, but you cannot. They don't exist yet, right? Because participants.
Even if you did, you'd probably end up just like having blockchain bloat with the amount of transactions.
Oh, that's separate. That we will cover separately
through the network.
That we will cover separately. That's a separate problem. That's also that's also pretty bad. Yeah. So you cannot have the receipts as of after 7, because as you produce 8, the participants in shard 1 they concurrently with you applying 7, right? So because you want their receipts, they want your receipts, right? So one of you have to produce. Sorry, this is one of you have to produce your chunk earlier. So whomever of you produced the chunk earlier cannot have the receipts from the other one. But also, at this time, we don't really need the receipts because at this time we're not applying 8 yet. So what happens after that is we're producing the block at height 8. So this was 7.
Yeah.
This is 8. Right? We're producing this block. And so now consider the person who is about to produce 9 in the shard 2. When they're accepting this block, this is when they need to accept this block, they need to receive a share from every shard. And so as we send that share for them, we also send. So they're saying, like, give me the share of this chunk in shard 1. So whomever is sending them the share in chunk 1, it's someone who tracks shard 1 fully. They will also send them all the receipts that go from shard 1 to shard 2 as of after applying block 7.
Of just those transactions that are crossed.
Yes, just the transactions which specifically crossing from 1 to 2. Yes.
They're not sending like every transaction from that.
Just the receipts that go from 1 to 2 are going to be sent as they receive this little share of the block 8, right? And they will apply those receipts as they are applying chunk at 8, right? Because chunk at 8, they will learn about it as of after receiving this block. Does make sense? So by the time they fully accepted the block at height 8, yeah.
So then the block 8 cross shard transactions get applied.
But those are block 7. Those are block 7, right? Yeah.
Sure. So block 7 cross shard transactions
will be applied in block 9.
Block 9.
But notice that the transaction, so it might appear as 2 blocks time, but actually it is 1 block time because the transaction itself, that produced the receipt was applied at the, do I have another color? The transaction that produced the receipt was applied approximately here. This is when it was applied because it was included at 7, but it was applied before 8. This is when the first step hop of the transaction got applied. The second hop got applied here. So the time between 2 hops is exactly 1 block. And so if it has another hop, if it goes to another shard, it will be applied at the very next height. And so because of that, if your transaction touches like 5 shards, it will be applied in 5 block time, not in 10 block time.
Yeah.
Which is.
But then if you have a reversion, then it ends up being reverted on this chain.
So it is completely atomic because if your reversion happens to be as of before this block, then the transaction was not applied initially to begin with. If the reversion happened to be here between 8 and 9, then whomever applies, like there's another block, it's hard to draw here.
Then that would be essentially applied in block 11.
Oh, it doesn't matter when it is. Yeah, it might be applied later. But what is important is that the receipt cannot get lost because the receipt is.
No, that's important because you want, if you have a chance for reversion and you're looking at block 11 as your finality timeline where the picture of finality starts to take hold, and then we're looking at 4 blocks.
Oh, so if reversion happens, you can look at significantly more because reversion can happen, let's say, within an hour, right?
For sure.
I'm using the constant of an hour. That constant is not decided.
By the way, but what is tentatively the plan for epoch length?
Half a day.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then effectively it could be that, right?
Right. Okay. So unless reversion happens, and if you some sort of an exchange or someone who runs every shard, you will know that reversion will not happen because you're tracking all the shards. So unless reversion happens, and assuming that there is no heartbeat skipped, receipts take exactly 1 block height to propagate, which is pretty good given like the arguments I provided before for why it is relatively hard to achieve. Also, they're atomic because when you apply this state root, right, in the chunk at height 8, it contains the state root. It also contains the outgoing receipt root, right? And so no matter when you produce the new chunk in the second shard, you will always say, so let's say 8 was not produced, 9 was not produced, or like let's say 9 was not produced and 10 was not produced, and at some point you're producing, here 11 or whatever. When you produce 11, you will say, what was the last one I included that was in my shard? It was 8. And so starting from 8 for every height, you will be pulling those shares from the shards that will contain the receipts. Those receipts contain the proof against the outgoing receipt Merkle root, right? And so there's no way you will not collect all the receipts. There's also no way for you to exclude some of them, because when you include the receipts ultimately into the chunk, everybody can verify that they match the Merkle root in the other shard, right? So atomicity is guaranteed. It is impossible not to include the receipt, and the receipts propagate in one block time. But you brought up a very important point, which is there are many ways to start abusing this. The easiest way is you can start sending to all shard transactions that all generate receipts into shard 1, right? So let's say the block can include 100 transactions, right, without loss of generality, right? So every block can handle 100 transactions. So to every chunk, so to every shard you send 100 transactions, each of which will generate a receipt toward shard 1. So at the end of the application of that height, shard 1 is looking. There's 10,000 receipts going to shard 1. So shard 1 is overwhelmed. Yeah. Naturally, they cannot apply them all at once. I will not be able to tell you the full solution right now. It's not me, it's Eugene who works on it. But on the high level, what happens is that there's a queue of those receipts. So all 10,000 receipts actually will go to shard 1. And that will create quite a bit of network overhead on that particular iteration.
How do you create the queue? What would be the canonical attestation of time there?
So the queue is only maintained by the actual shard 1, right? So they receive. So on the first timestamp when that happened, they will actually get all the 10,000 receipts, and it will create some very unfortunate events in the network, because they will have to retrieve quite a bit of data. But once they put those 10,000 receipts, they sort of say, okay, guys, we have too much at this point. Everybody knows about it. It is included in the next chunk they produce. And so at that point, I think what we do is we just disallow receipts to go to the shard. So the transaction which tries to send the receipt into the shard, which has a queue which is too long, it will just fail and unroll all the way back. But yeah, so that's again, this is not rocket science, but also this is not quite ours. This is Quark Chain's approach. They also do that. They also have the queue in every shard that has receipts, and like receipts just add up to the queue, and you get the front from the queue. And all of that, all those misbehaviors can be proven. It's not easy to prove them, but they all cryptographically provable. So you can prove that receipts were added to the queue. You can prove that you took the beginning from the queue. Cool.
Okay. Dean.
Yeah.
Any questions, comments, critiques, things like that?
No, right now I'm just thinking about this.
Right. So we can also talk about adaptive corruption, because naturally, with only 20 block producers per shard, adaptively corrupting them is well, maybe not trivial, but clearly doable, right? And so if we adaptively corrupt 20 block producers, then they can apply arbitrary state transition or make they can do quite a bit of damage. So there's a naive. Naively, we can say that there is always a fisherman, right? So Mir is going to be running every shard, Coinbase is going to be running every shard. Let's say Binance is running every shard. So we can assume that there is always a fisherman in every shard. And so for as long as data availability is not violated,
because of just like large players that
track all the shards,
validating every transaction across all shards.
Yeah, but that's like more naive statement. But this is like the first argument. There's going to be a stronger argument in a second.
Yeah.
And so naively you expect that for as long as data is available, data availability is crucial, because if data is not available, you can create invalid state transition, not distribute the chunk, right? Yes. And so nobody can create a challenge. Yeah. But for data to violate data availability, it's not enough to corrupt a particular chunk, a particular shard. You need to corrupt actually more than a large percentage of the total population, right?
You just need to corrupt
block producers
of one chunk, right?
For data availability, no. For data availability, you need to corrupt 30% of the entire set of block producers.
Okay.
No, across all chunks, because across all shards, because when you create a chunk, the shares are going to all the block producers, right? So but for as long as data availability is there, fisherman will work. In practice, it will work. Like in practice, and for what we're going to be launching soonish, that's going to be the only.
Depending on what economic incentives there are for fishermen, right?
Actually, fishermen have no economic incentive. The reason for that is that if you create a challenge as a fisherman, whomever actually going to be including it into the block, they can always front run you. They will get your challenge and submit it from their name. And preventing that front running is possible. You can do some commit reveal scheme or something like that, but it all delays the time to challenge. And for challenge, you want it to land as fast as possible. Like ideally, when the invalid block is produced, the challenge should immediately be distributed through the network.
Sure.
Ideally, you want the block to be reverted before the next one is even produced, right?
But then if there's no economic incentive, then what stops people from just challenging every single block and civil attacking them?
Oh no. To challenge, you need to have a stake. Invalid challenge is a slashable behavior.
Sure, but why would I bother challenging if it costs me stake but I earn no reward?
So the idea is that the people who will challenge are going to be people who have some other
people who just like benevolently want the system to be
like, for example, I myself want it, right? So as I said, like Near, for example, will be running the full set.
You'll run
that's obviously not very good for.
You'll run fishermen.
Yeah. That's a weak argument for decentralization, you know.
Yeah.
But naturally, hypothetical Coinbase, if they list Near, they have a very strong incentive for an invalid set transition not to go through.
No,
right?
But see, you also use the example of Binance, and I would actually flip that. And this could be applied to not necessarily Binance, but any others, where Binance has inherently a very large financial incentive to
break
see the
Near.
collapse of Near.
But
So
by not
then-
submitting challenge, they're not doing much damage.
Sure.
We can just
Sure, but why wouldn't they just then submit challenges incessantly? And
like invalid challenges.
Yeah, and
because every invalid challenge will slash them. Invalid
slash
challenge
them.
costs money, right? So what a malicious actor can try to do is they can create an invalid state transition, and after they create an invalid state transition, they can sacrifice a lot of stake and start spamming with invalid challenges so that the valid challenge doesn't go through. That is, first of all, very expensive, but second of all, the idea is that every invalid challenge just delays the time until valid can go through. And so like that's one way to address it. I didn't think too much about it. Maybe there's some issues with that, but submitting invalid challenges for an hour at every block is extremely expensive.
Generally, I would want to think about this further, but generally, there would be some concern with just imbalance in economic incentives, and so like if you only have fishermen who are inherently benevolent in the system, then then you may only get a certain type of challenge. You may not get the whole breadth of challenges, right?
But again, as I said, that's a sort of naive solution. That's all we're going to have when we launch, because in expectation, nobody will try to break anywhere near in the first year or so.
I would argue the opposite. That like
so far, the bugs of ridiculous extent were living in blockchains for years without being caught. So because like the sophistication of the attack is actually pretty big. You need to, first of all, you need to adaptively corrupt an entire shard, which is doable, but it is expensive, right? You actually do need to pay the stake because 20 block producers will be slashed.
Yeah.
Right. So you actually do need to pay 20 block producers their stake. Second of all, you do need to ensure that not a single fisherman will challenge, right? So like you need to be sure that Coinbase doesn't challenge, Near doesn't challenge, whomever else doesn't challenge, right? So it's a very expensive attack, which has very little chance of actually going through, right? But we do have a better solution. So first of all, let's actually quickly talk about how Ethereum solves it and why we do not do the same. So the way Ethereum solves it is they say, like, why is our epoch half a day and Ethereum can shuffle every 6 minutes is because in Ethereum, the validating node does not need to have the state, and in Near it does need to have a state. And the difference is that in Ethereum, the block, when it is distributed, or like what would be a chunk in our case, it has witnesses. It has Merkle proofs of the state that before the transaction and after the transaction, right? And those witnesses, they actually make blocks quite a bit bigger. They make them order of magnitude bigger. And so that's the main reason why we don't do that, because increasing by an order of magnitude amount of traffic is actually quite expensive. But what they allow to do, they actually give you a ridiculous level of security because adaptive corruption becomes practically impossible. It's practically impossible to corrupt within 6 minutes, or like whatever is the time. Like someone could argue, like your fellow stop and decrypt will be obviously arguing that that is not secure. But six minutes for all practical purposes, adaptive corruption is impossible. But in Near, because we don't want to send witnesses with every block, we do need to have the full state, and then loading the full state for a shard takes quite a while, right? And so therefore we do need to have longer epoch length. So what do we do? What we plan to do for to fight adaptive corruption is we want to have the second role, which we call validators. There are two reasons why we don't launch them with mainnet. One is that they actually will take quite a bit of time to build, right? So that would easily delay us for another year or so. But the second reason is that we're just not going to have enough. I mean, we're not Ethereum. When we launch, we're just not going to have enough people who run near to have sufficient validators
right?
to make what I will describe any meaningful, right? But the idea is that you have block producers. So block producers we have on order of 200. Those block producers. Those are known. You know which block producers produce blocks for which shards. Their schedule is known. They are adaptively corruptible. There's a larger set of validators. So let's call them validators. And so this set is significantly larger. So ideally, you would want to have well, as many as you can. Like you want to have as many validators per shard as possible. And here, what is important is that you don't know which validator is validating what shard. What validator is doing is that when the epoch starts, the validator. So this is let's look from perspective of a single validator. They run a VRF, and the VRF will give them a bit mask of a subset of shards. And so effectively, you run a VRF in a way that will give you precisely, like, let's say 5 shards. So let's say we want every validator to validate exactly 5 shards. So they run a VRF to get exactly 5 shards, and so they locally know which shards they're validating, but nobody else does. So what they do is that when they receive a block, so this is a block, right? They download the chunks from the shards they validate them, and if they all valid, they sign on the block, right? And so how exactly we accumulate signatures we will discuss in a second, but they sign on the block. And if at least one transaction is not valid, they commit to that block being invalid, right? Or so for simplicity, let's say that they create a message, and that message either says yay, and so yay means I validated all my shards and my shards are good, or it says nay, and it contains the challenge. And so then they commit within the next 10 blocks, or like some number of blocks, doesn't matter how many. Within the next 10 blocks, they commit to this message, and then within the next that many blocks, they need to reveal the message, right? Cool. So what happens next is if a particular,
but they don't get anything if they're right on that challenge. So why bother challenging?
So validators, they just get constant reward.
Sure.
So a validator at the end of the epoch, just for being a validator, they get constant reward.
Yep.
Which is dependent on how many times they committed / revealed. Also, you only reveal. You also only reveal if.
But they get like.
Oh, you always reveal, yeah.
Whether they challenge or not, they get the same. They get the same.
To an extent.
Right.
So to an extent.
So like why why bother to challenge?
No, they do not. You see, it's not an option for them to send or not to send that commit. They have to send the commit. If they don't send the commit, they don't get reward for that particular hide. So at every hide, they will either commit to yay, or to the challenge, right?
Yeah.
So effectively, your question is not why bother sending challenge. Your question is more like why not just always submit yay?
Yeah.
So what happens is, that once an actual challenge arrives, if an actual challenge does happen,
and you're wrong,
then every block producer, but here's the thing, because we don't know which shards they're validating. It could be so. Imagine that. Go ahead.
Can I not find out what shards they're validating by knowing what chunks they're downloading?
So by analyzing network, you can try to deduce it. So the idea would be to, like the idea for such a block producer is to keep their account which signs independent from the node that's running. So like you can identify that a particular node in the network is downloading particular chunks, but you don't know. Like ideally, you don't. The validator should try to conceal, like effectively send your challenges from a different IP address. Then we cannot enforce it. It would be great if we find a way to enforce them in some way, to not, because obviously if they use the same machine to send the signatures and to accumulate chunks, then yes, then they can easily be attributed by someone who monitors network.
Which most will probably do.
If you don't have any immediate questions that you want to look at right now, I would motion to cut this now. I got to run to my next meeting, and we only had until 11:30 anyways, and I imagine you've got a whole bunch of stuff to do. But do you have any last questions or comments or things that you want to go over, or or maybe come
No,
back
not
to?
right now, but I want to think about it a little more, and then probably like either email you or message
So if you
you.
have one more minute, I can
Sure.
like
Yeah,
quickly
let's-
finish
yeah,
what
let's
happens
finish
here.
that.
So what happens here is that at the end of the day, if any challenge goes through, then all the block producers, all the validators, they need to reveal their mask, the one that they committed to with the VRF. They committed at the beginning of the epoch, right? And so then in the mask, you can see if they were supposed to produce yay or the challenge. So effectively, they have to reveal their mask, and they have to reveal what they committed to, right? And so if they, this is the only place where being offline can slash you, because if you don't reveal your mask within like next 5 epochs, you get slashed. Right, because we need to see if you were supposed to challenge or not. Right, so effectively, when the challenge is revealed, you must reveal your mask, which either needs to have 0 in the shard that gets challenged, or it needs to get 1, but your commit should be for the challenge as well.
So then
Right.
an attacker would probably wait to attack the network and try to force validators offline until there's a challenge.
But we can give a very long period of time for you to reveal. Like effectively, we're just
You
saying,
said 5 epochs.
like in reality, we can make it completely unbounded. We can say your stake is locked until you reveal. Like effectively, for you to get your stake back, your unstaking transaction just needs to include that information.
That would be interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
And so there is a Nash equilibrium where all the validators agree to always say yay, right? But for as long as at least one of them sends challenges, everybody who did not validate committed to yay, and it was a challenge, they will get slashed, right? And so now
if
adaptive.
everybody says yay, and the challenger the challenger who challenges, even if they're challenging correctly, could. I mean, it would.
Yeah,
it would just
everybody will
require-
get
it would
slashed.
require not necessarily, not if more than 2/3 are saying yay, correct?
It doesn't matter how many said yay, because the moment challenge got into the network, the moment challenge landed into the blockchain, and challenges they included on the top level into the blocks. That moment, for you to get your stake back, you have to provide a proof that you did not commit to yay, right? So you would not be able to get your stake back without, if you committed to yay on an invalid chunk, you will never be able to get your stake back. So effectively, it is slashed
on an invalid chunk, right?
Yeah.
But effectively, 2/3 could validate a chunk with yay.
Oh no, the validity of chunk is not defined by how many people endorsed it. The validity of chunk is defined by very strict rules. So a challenge can say, it doesn't matter, it could be that 100% of people, or like 100% minus one people signed on it, but the challenge will just say, hi guys, this is the pre-state root, this is the post-state root that they signed upon, this is a set of transactions, apply them for yourself, and see that it doesn't apply. And at that point, we actually do stateless validation. So we actually do send the witnesses for the state before and after, and people can actually apply them without downloading state. So we do have the technique from Ethereum, we just don't use it on every block.
And check that.
And that technique actually is implemented. So hidden validators are not implemented, but the stateless validation is implemented. Yeah.
Right.
Cool. Okay.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Cool.
Awesome. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.